Hello, and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. As you know, I like to seek out lesser-known topics of the Second World War. Well, I have a cracker for you. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the British Army's Middle East Anti-Locust Unit. Due to locusts threatening local food crops in the Middle East and to prevent valuable shipping space being used to import food, the unit was created and tasked with waging war on locusts. Joining me is Athol Yates. Athol is an assistant professor at the Institute for International and Civil Security at the Khalifa University in the Arab Emirates. He has recently published the paper, The British Military and the Anti-Locust Campaign Across the Arab Peninsula, including the Emirates 1942-45. Now, this podcast is brought to you with the kind donations of fellow listeners. If you think there is a vast machine at work in the background with assistant researchers and audio engineers all beavering away, paid for by a philanthropic millionaire, well, you'd be wrong. It's just me. But I could use your help. All this costs me, and it's not just my time. Software and research material are ongoing costs. How can I help, I hear you cry? Well, if each one of you tossed a shekel in my virtual tip jar at patreon.com/WW2podcast, I would have a pretty good monthly salary. But I appreciate not everyone has the luxury of spare change. But if you do enjoy the show every couple of weeks, why not go to patreon.com/WW2podcast and become a patron of the show. Think of it like subscribing to a magazine, but rather than a piece of plastic tat you occasionally get taped to the front cover, I'll try and give you some audio extras from the chats I have, bits left on the virtual cutting room floor. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast. Athol, thanks for joining me. Now, I guess the first thing to do is look at locust. Plagues of locust are not something I know much about, so let's start with them. How much of a problem are they in the Middle East?
So locusts have always been a huge challenge to agriculturally based communities in the Middle East region, and they date back to biblical times. But typically in any century, take the 20th century, there'll be multiple eras of locusts. So I think in the 20th century, there was about 7 major periods when there was locust plagues. Typically, they range from 1 to 8 years, and there'll often be periods within that where there'll be a year or many months of locusts, then it seems to die down and there's nothing around, and then they reappear. And during the World War II, the plagues lasted from 1941 to 1947.
What surprised me is how they're massively devastating, aren't they? What did I note down? They can eat enough food for 35,000 people, one plague. Is that right? A day. That's a tremendous amount they're going through.
Yes, they'll strip everything quite bare, anything green, and that will include bark. Once these plagues descend, they'll stay there, eat it all, and once it's finished, they'll fly on. So these plagues, these swarms, which is the flying version of it as distinct from the hopper version, the flying version of the plagues can have many millions and even up to 1 billion insects in one swarm. Typically, they'll be able to strip an area within a couple of hours when there's very large numbers in the Arabian Peninsula region, and then they'll just fly on again.
And they're travelling, 30 miles a day? So they're stripping vast areas, aren't they?
It depends on the wind conditions, but they can fly up to 200 kilometres a day if the wind is quite good. So the way it works is that they wait till the sun comes up and then it's quite warms up their bodies, and then they'll take to wing. And they can often fly all day non-stop, up to about 12 hours, and then they land. And what this means is they can cross water bodies, so they can easily cross the Red Sea or the Arabian Gulf, so they can move frequently, if the wind's blowing in the right direction, across continents, in effect.
It's incredible. So traditionally, is there much that could be done, or did people just have to live through it?
So in pre-1900s, they would simply try to protect their crops in any way they could, rather than take any offensive actions against the swarms. And so that typically would involve banging pots and pans, trying to make noise. They would set fire to bushes, try to create a lot of smoke to encourage the hoppers to leave the crops alone.
So presumably, I mean, we've got to be looking at the specifically the Second World War. Is there a chemical poisons that come online by the Second World War?
Yes, they started to introduce them in the Second World War, a chemical, sodium arsenate, that was then laced with bran, and they'd sprinkle that out, and then the insects would eat that. And that was the first of them. They also had started trialling a bit of aerial spraying in the sort of 43, 44, but that hadn't taken off in any substantial way until the just after the war, in effect. It might be useful at this point to actually give you a bit more background on the insects, because it's really important to understand how this all works. So in general, the locust grasshoppers are not a species in their own right. What they are is a label that's applied to a couple of types of grasshoppers that display certain behaviours that change their physiology and their colour when they all come together. So there is 3 phases. So the first phase is solitary grasshoppers. So these are, there's about 8 different types of these grasshoppers that are maybe about an inch and a half long, and they're pretty solitary creatures. They fly only in the evening and then only for an hour or two. And then there's another phase of the grasshoppers, which is called the gregarious phase. In this condition, the grasshoppers form these swarms, and after warming up in the sun, off they go. They start flying, then eating in a swarm, laying eggs, and moving on. Now, between those 2 phases, there's another phase called a transitional phase, and that's the phase where and it can go both ways. It can go from solitary to gregarious, and then from gregarious to solitary. And in the transitional phase, what happens is that food or wind has brought a number of these grasshoppers together. And when they start coming together and physically touching each other, they go through this phase change to create these gregarious grasshoppers. Now, typically, these grasshoppers will live for about 3 to 5 months. And over that period of time, that they may go through 4 or 5 periods where they lay a lot of eggs. And so those eggs then materialise. They are normally laid in just sand dunes or in barren areas, straight in the dirt. They pop out. And then when they pop out, they come out as a wingless nymph, which is called a hopper. So these things can hop along, but they don't have wings and they can't fly. And what happens is that when they start hopping around and they come together in the gregarious, start to become a gregarious group, they'll then start consuming huge amounts of food because they go through a number of molts. And in that molt period, their body hardens and their wings grow. Now, this is really important because as soon as they take wing, traditionally or historically, there's been no way to counter them, because until you have aerial spraying, you can't counter flying grasshoppers because they land, and by the time you get there with any spray, there's in such a large area you just can't deal with them. So what you've got to be able to do is actually stop the hopper phase because they're just along the ground. It was only in about 1921 that a British-Russian entomologist by a chap called Boris Ulvanov discovered the locust grasshoppers were not a species in their own right. But what they didn't know at that time was where were they breeding? Because there was very few decent maps of the Arabian Peninsula, certainly in East Africa. There was limited knowledge about that. So what he wanted to know was where were they breeding, because if they could figure out where they were breeding, they could then send in parties to kill the hoppers before they took off. Because once they took off, that particular insect then would breed 5 times. So the whole activity prior to the war was they started to think about how do we find out where these insects are breeding, under what conditions do they breed, and how do we stop them? Now, then you come up to late 39s where they started to have regional conferences of locust control entities from, say, India, Egypt, Sudan, and of course Britain, to work out the best way to start organising a offensive operation against the insects. And it was only during World War II that they started to master this.
So let's come to the Second World War. The Middle East is a major theatre, 40-43. I imagine British military planners hadn't put much thought into any need for locust control. So how does the British military become involved in locust control?
So the locust officers in the early 1940s had recognised that there was a multi-year plague of locusts that were in the region, and they had started to take some serious action against them by sending out locust teams to counter the 1941-42 plague. And that traditionally involved doing some simple measures such as digging a big trench and then putting a barrier behind it so that the hoppers, as they hopped along the ground, would hit the trench, and then there'd be gaps in the fence line, which would be normally sheet tin that would be put into the ground, and any break in the barrier, there'd be a big depression, and then the hoppers would hop in there, and then they would bury them or burn them. They could spray oil on them, and occasionally people tried to use flamethrowers, but they were advised that this was actually a very dangerous activity to do, so they discontinued that. So that was sort of okay in the 1941-42 period, but they could see that the amount of locusts was going to increase in subsequent years. Now, this had a significant impact on food production in the region because locust plagues weren't limited to the Middle East. They would be in East Africa, but also Iran and India. So these were very important bread baskets, and their food production was needed not only to supply to Britain during the war, but also to supply the populations locally. Now, the British military had recognised that if the amount of agriculture reduced significantly, they were faced with the problem of what do we do? Do we let the populations in the Middle East and Iran and India suffer a famine, or do we divert food stocks that are really needed for the war effort? And had they diverted food stocks, which also included shipping, of course, and all the distribution system, that could significantly delay offensive operations that were hoped to kick off in, 43 and onwards.
I think that's the interesting. 200,000 tons of wheat would be needed to be imported.
Yeah, so it wasn't only the food, it was actually the shipping needed and then the distribution for it. And that would require a great deal of vehicles. We would definitely needed in other fronts at that point.
So the British, is it the British military that set up the Middle East Anti-Locust Unit? It's a military unit?
No, it wasn't a military unit. It was led by the British, and the significant funding of it was from the British government. And what it consisted of was really a group of allied nations and their governments' locust control officers and agencies, because prior to the war, everybody was doing things in isolation. During the war, they brought them together under the leadership of this British-Russian entomologist. And to support their work, they were given the assistance of this military organisation called Middle East Supply Centre, which was really responsible for logistics in the Middle East. And they organised the support of the British military, which was primarily British Army, but some RAF and some British Royal Navy support to aid the Middle East Anti-Locust Unit in carrying out their work.
It's quite a sizable commitment for the British Army as well. 1,000 men at one point, 200 trucks in 43, 44?
Yeah, so it was a sizable commitment. The British Army component in 1943-1944 was about 850 officers and other ranks, of which about half of them, about 400 were Brits, about 360 were Palestinians enlisted, and they supplied about 330 trucks, including 10 tank transporters. The reason for that was if you can imagine, the challenge in undertaking these anti-locust operations was really a logistics challenge, because what you had to do is move the teams of locust responders to the areas where there were locusts. You deploy them and you've got to support them. And you're doing this in an environment where there's no roads, really harsh geography, because you've got a lot of sand, very humid conditions, a lot of salt. So vehicles were failing quite rapidly, and they'd have a life of about a year over a summer period. So you needed the tank transporters to move the vehicles to repair points. And you'd also need a lot of vehicles to supply water and food and bait, because the teams would go through a great deal of all of those resources. And the Arabian Peninsula is a huge area.
That was going to be my next question. How big is it? It is a huge area, isn't it, the Arabian Peninsula? It's not as if they're just dealing with Egypt and sort of Syria, those Mediterranean countries. They're going all the way. It's Saudi Arabia and what are the states at the end? At the time they were known as the Trucial States?
The Trucial States, yeah, which is now called the United Arab Emirates, and Oman and Yemen were the major concerns at that point, rather than Egypt, because the locusts were really in that area. Much of the country is too dry to have a lot of locusts, but when there's a cyclone or other rains, you will get large numbers breeding, and then the cycle starts. So they sent them down to those areas which were particular concerns. Now, they were mostly in parts of Saudi Arabia and along the Trucial States, which borders the Arabian Gulf and Oman, because these are areas that often get quite a lot of rain. So that's where they were deploying. So the way it would work is the locust officers would be in charge of an area, and he would be supported by the British Army that would have the vehicles and the logistics support for it. Then they would engage local labourers who would do the work. So they would have to have spotters out who would identify where these hopper bands were starting to appear. They would then get that information back to the team. The British military drivers would load up some workers. They would drive out there, often in the middle of nowhere, and these bands could be 500 metres long. So they would take a great deal of time to kill those by spreading out the brand that had the poison in it. And then after that's done, then they'll jump back on the truck, and then they'd go back to the next place where the hoppers have been spotted. So it was sort of a radial system out, and they'd have a small supply base, and they would do that. Then they might have to move a couple of 100 kilometres to another area where they were having another outbreak for. And sometimes those labourers would go with them. Sometimes they'd be dismissed and new ones would occur. So in general, what was sort of happening is that in December, the major swarms would start to descend. They would start to lay the eggs there. Then over February and March, the hoppers would all start to appear. And by that stage, the swarm that laid them had moved on somewhere else and the process had started again. But the ones that had been born, or the hoppers that were appearing in February and March, then would take to the wing, and then they would start laying in May. And if the climate was right, this could just happen multiple times. Then it would lay low over summer, simply because the summer heat in the Arabian Peninsula, up to 50 degrees, is a bit too hot even for them. And then it would start again later in the year. So this was a really hard mission for these guys to do. It would wear out the vehicles. It required a huge amount of logistics, and yet and planning, because what they couldn't do is carry enough bait with them. What they would have to do is pre-position many tons of this bait in the months leading up to it, hence why you needed the Royal Navy or other vessels to actually ship this stuff around, pre-position it, then all the vehicles and everybody would arrive at the right time, and off they would go for the campaign against the locusts.
I was going to say, it does sound like a military campaign. You've got those stories of how they used to, before they went on the offensive in the Middle East, move fuel dumps up to the front so they could move off, so it wasn't all being carried up from the rear once an offensive starts. Sounds very much like military planning, having to set a base dump for all your poison and your baits. Now, the Arab Peninsula, politically, I'm not completely sure how Saudi stood, but the Trucial States were semi-independent. How do they feel about bands of roving, British troops moving through their land?
At that time, and starting from the early 1800s, Britain had a series of treaty arrangements with a number of the Arab Gulf rulers. We're talking here Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and the Trucial States, and Oman, but slightly different in Oman. And the arrangements were really with the coastal rulers, and the borders were not set at that point. The borders really weren't established in say, the Trucial States until the 50s. So the hinterland was really an area that wasn't controlled by the rulers who lived on the coastal areas, and there were in effect other paramount sheikhs on the inner areas, and they weren't particularly enamoured by having British military personnel wandering around, because firstly they saw them very rarely, but also there was a lot of the areas had never been explored. So parts of the empty quarter of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates wasn't explored until 1948. That looks like the first time a white man walked across that area, and he did it under the guise of a desert locust officer, incidentally. But in that time, there was some hostility towards foreign military, and in some cases, in the case of Oman and the hinterland of Oman and the Trucial States, they would sometimes refuse entry to the locust parties. And in places like Saudi Arabia, due to the sensitivity of having foreigners in their land, they would require the British Army personnel to remove all badges of rank and their headwear. They wouldn't be allowed to wear British military headwear, and they had to wear the headdress of the local Arabs there. And weapons also weren't allowed at certain times.
With the RAF, how much was the RAF involved? I mean, presumably they could have been used for spotting swarms as they got going, and as you did mention spraying. I don't know if they were spraying during the war as well.
Now, there was a RAF detachment in Iran that was trialling spraying, but the RAF was of virtually no use for the spotting of them, because what you needed to have was on-the-ground knowledge of the environmental conditions, so that you could get in early and destroy the hoppers as they started to appear. Spotting flying swarms was very limited use, because if they could move 200 kilometres a day, where they were the next day after they'd been spotted was potentially 200 kilometres away. So you couldn't deploy vehicles there with no roads in that area, so they weren't any use. They tried implementing a system of when US and British civil and military aircraft were flying over the region. They were meant to report if they saw any swarms. And not only administratively was that of limited effectiveness, but also the information that was collected was, by the time the actual people in the field got it, it was irrelevant. So no, they were no great use that way. They were only useful in deploying, in supporting the logistics operations.
So 44, 45, the military contingent is reduced. Now, is this a reflection of how less important the Middle East is as a theatre for war, or is it a reflection of how successful they had been?
Well, they were certainly very successful in 43, 44, because it was the first time there was a offensive operation undertaken against the locusts. It was quite a marvellous achievement. Yeah, and it did certainly reduce the numbers and it increased the crop yield. So food issues wasn't such an issue there, but also there was other requirements for military personnel and issues of the negative consequences resulting from loss of local food supplies would not have had such a serious impact at that point. So it was not prioritised. However, they did still help. They still supplied a number of vehicles and personnel to help out. But also the other thing that had changed was that the civilian organisation of the anti-locust activities had also improved.
So they've been handing on the knowledge and getting all that engaged. So my assumption is that increasingly, at the end of the war, the civilian organisation takes over?
Yeah, in principle they do, and they still exist today, the anti-locust activities. The descendants of today's ones are those guys back in that period where, again, it's a multinational effort to combat this continuous challenge of locusts. After the war, the other major change was Britain didn't want to fund the Middle East anti-locust unit and the other activities simply because of the financial crisis and pressure that was under. And we saw then a lot more transferring of responsibility and power to the other states in the area of India and then subsequently Pakistan, Sudan and Egypt. They took a lot more control of those activities. However, after there was no permanent military, British military in the Trucial States area until 1951, and then there was a local group called the Trucial Oman Levies and Trucial Oman Scouts that existed up to 1971. They were a British officered but Arab manned force. They sometimes were involved in countering the locusts, just as we have at the moment. You see pictures of Sudanese army personnel involved in the counter-locust programs going on right at this moment.
So, I mean, I guess finally, if we look at the operation during the wars, did they achieve their goal of reducing food imports to the Middle East and freeing up that extra shipping space and logistic supports for the military?
Yeah, it was undeniably a great success. The crop yield from the year before had been down because of the drought conditions that was occurring independent of the locusts in certain parts of it, particularly Egypt. But we saw a bit of better weather anyway in 43, 44, so the crop yields did increase and the problems from the locusts were nowhere near as significant had they not been counted in that operation. So I think it was an undeniable success. Did it lead to improvement in the military prospects? Yeah, I think the answer is it certainly contributed to the war effort in a significant way.
Fantastic. What a fantastic small piece of history that you've sort of dug up that I'm sure no one will have ever heard of apart from those few families that somehow were connected to people who were involved with it.
Yeah, it's a really interesting period in time. And if your listeners want to have a look at what's currently occurring with the locust swarms at the moment in Ethiopia, Kenya and Somalia, it's really quite a concerning picture. We're currently getting minor outbreaks in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Iran and Pakistan, but the weather over the last couple of years has been really good for them. So we've had lots of multiple hatchings and multiple swarms. because the instability in parts of Africa and certainly in Yemen, you've not been able to send in the locust control officers like we've been able to do in the past. So the rest of this year and next year, you're going to see some devastating impacts from the locusts.
I'll put those links you sent me on the website. I had to look at them. They're accompanied by some fantastic photography that goes with them. So what are you what are you looking at next? What's your next future piece of research?
So I've got 4 things that I'm doing that's all interrelated. First one is going to be looking at the history of the defence of Bahrain during World War II, because it was a key oil producer, a really key geographic location at in the northern part of the Gulf. And given what was going on in Iran and Iraq in the 1941 period, it was really important. But it's a fascinating story that nobody's really looked at, because it gives a wonderful history of how the Commonwealth, with all of its empire resources, was able to bring together support from different parts, from British India, from as far as Singapore and Hong Kong, to help defend the island against, firstly, Italian bombers, because there was an Italian bombing run there in 1940, and then the concern was against Japanese parachutists and submarine raiders. So that's one of them. The second one is I'm looking at the history of the British military in the Gulf from 1941 to 71 before the final withdrawal. How do you maintain security in this informal part of the British Empire? It's quite fascinating. My next book we're working on is looking at the police and military history of the Gulf Arab states from 1921 to 1980. And finally, I'm looking at the contribution of Western expats to building the Gulf Arab police and militaries. So I put out a call to any of your listeners that if you've had direct involvement in any of these areas, I'd be certainly interested in interviewing you. And if you're interested in reviewing drafts of what my papers are, or the book chapters that we're working on, and you have a knowledge and interest in this area, I'd be certainly delighted to send them to you guys, because I've found that there's significant improvements both in the factual information and also in the narrative itself can be obtained by just putting out to people who have an interest in this area, even if they're not experts.
It's an area certainly during the war that always gets overlooked. I mean, Iraq kind of gets a bit of a nod because there's almost a revolution there, isn't there? Is that what you refer to it as? The RAF predominantly put down, but I guess in this area, it's in the region. The Middle East gets painted as a big Middle East region, but we're actually talking of Syriana and Egypt, aren't we? When we're looking at that theatre of operations is the Western perspective of it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a real fair call, because certainly a lot of coverage on Libya and the Mediterranean part of the Middle East. Very little consideration of the invasion of Iran and the invasion of Iraq in 41. Both of them are really interesting activities that just don't get much mention because they were over fairly quickly.
Now, certainly the Iraq constantly appears as a footnote to something is always alluded to, and then never really gets fleshed out. The Germans were making overtures, weren't they, to some of the powerful politicians in Iraq, hoping to pull them on side. And I can't quite recall, but the RAF flew in a lot of troops or something, and didn't they, and sort of prevented it happening.
Part of the reason it gets overlooked is that in terms of combat operations, it wasn't anywhere near the scale of other places. But what was important is the staging points. So the RAF had a base there, and that was as another base in Bahrain and so on. And these were very important in the aerial lines of communication out to the empire in the east. So that's why it was really important there. 41, there was a coup there. The leaders of that coup, the Iraqi government at that time, then put pressure on and then attacked the British base. So you had a two-pronged attack. You had one coming up from the north up through Basra, with British India troops, and then you had one coming eastward from Palestine to relieve the British air base. So you had that, and then a couple of months later you had another force that went into Iran, with the Soviets coming down from the south in a pincer movement. Actually, I forgot there's also another force going eastward from Baghdad as well to maintain a corridor that was then critical for the supply of Lend-Lease materials to the Soviets. Remember 41, late 41, it was looking pretty bad for the Soviets at that point.
Yeah. It's a water route to get material in rather than the Arctic convoys, presumably through the Middle East. Fascinating. I hadn't realised the Japanese were interested in and around there. I mean, I don't know why they wouldn't be.
Yeah, well, they were increasingly moving westward, and their maritime presence was increasing as well. And so there was concern that they could be launching attacks because, remember, 241 they were looking pretty good at that point. They looked unstoppable, and so there was a lot of concern about that. There was a number of submarines sunk in the area, mostly Italians, by the late 40s, 41 in there. And they felt a great deal under pressure at that point. And had they lost the oil sources from that part of the Gulf, that would have severely impacted the war.
Well, perhaps we get you back for a chat about that. Thanks. Folks, you can find Athol's paper looking at the British Middle East Anti-Locust Unit in the journal Tribulus, volume 27. The article is entitled "The British Military and the Anti-Locust Campaign Across the Arab Peninsula, Including the Emirates, 1942-45. I can't remember if I've mentioned this before, but I have a new podcast. Oh, what a lovely podcast. It looks at the First World War and its influences on media and popular culture. As I type, we've just recorded an episode looking at heavy metal music, where we discussed Iron Maiden's Passchendaele and Metallica's One. If anyone is interested, you can find it in all the usual podcast places and at ohwhatalovelypodcast.co.uk. So that's all for me for now. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.